Traditionally, in Greek culture, there were four so-called cardinal virtues. These were termed cardinal when translated into Latin from the word cardo, or hinge. They were the virtues supposedly on which all others hinged. These were bravery, temperance, justice, and finally, wisdom. We've discussed bravery and temperance in a prior video. But what about the latter two? Wisdom for Aristotle is a complex virtue. In a way, what the tradition knew as wisdom, Aristotle analyzes into several distinct virtues of thought, of which a narrower conception of wisdom is only one. We'll cover these in the next video. What about justice? What kind of virtue is it? It's natural to think of justice as a virtue concerned with exchange and distribution of goods. The most common symbol of justice today is the scale, suggesting a balanced exchange or distribution. We know that Aristotle already thinks that the domains of physical pleasures and pains, money and material goods belong together to the appetitive, or the animal-like part of the soul, and therefore to the virtues of character. Generosity and magnificence are virtues concerned with the distribution of money and material goods. However, here the distribution is in one direction only, primarily in giving. Generosity also concerns in a secondary way right receiving, but the emphasis is on one-way receiving. The virtue of justice would therefore seem to be needed in order to supplement the account of right distribution contained in the discussions of generosity and magnificence. For, it seems, there's a virtue that involves right dealings in a voluntary way when the dealings are two-way or multilateral exchanges of money and material goods. This suggests a place for justice as a virtue of character. In another domain, justice is a virtue of a judge, jury, prosecutor, or others involved in the courts who have to dole out punishments, pain, as rectification for misdeeds of one sort or another. So again, there's a need to have justice in a person's character. In the face of this need, Aristotle also faces a powerful challenge to the narrow conception of justice as a virtue of character concerned in right exchanges. And this is the recent at his time, recent innovation of his teacher Plato, who conflated the traditional notion of justice into a general conception of human excellence as such. And this, of course, is what he did in his famous work, The Republic. I assume that most of you will have studied The Republic, or at least read it. In the near future, I will be producing a series covering the core argument of the Republic concerning justice. But for now, we need to have at least a rough sketch before us in order to be able to see how Aristotle is responding to it. Without this Platonic context, much of Aristotle's argument at the beginning of Book 5 can seem confusing or puzzling. So I'll go through this sketch quickly. I won't be writing things down on the whiteboard. I'll be assuming this is just a refresher for most of you, so I'm trying to stimulate what I hope is still a fairly vivid memory. Okay, so the aim of Plato's Republic is to show that justice is desirable for its own sake, regardless of its consequences. To do this, he tries to show that the possession of justice in the soul is sufficient by itself for the goodness and the happiness of the soul. This project requires Plato to engage in a psychological analysis of the soul so as to locate the justice in it. However, Plato does this by developing at some length an analogy between the soul and the city, the polis. The idea is that the city is analogous to the soul and can therefore represent the soul writ large so that it will be easier to see what makes a soul intrinsically good and happy if we first examine what makes a city good and happy. This launches Plato upon an elaborate imaginative construction of the ideal city. Such a city would contain, Plato argues, three parts. You'd have the guardians, the rulers, You would have the auxiliaries, essentially the military. And then third, you'd have the workers. So the three parts of the city are the guardian class, the auxiliary or military class, and the working class. Plato draws upon the conventional Greek assumption of the four cardinal virtues to characterize the desirable characteristics of the good city. In the good city, the four cardinal virtues are embodied by each of the classes. So we have in the good city the ruling class that will be characterized by wisdom, the warrior class that will be characterized by bravery, and the working class that will be characterized by temperance. And, of course, we still have one more virtue, but we've run out of classes in the city. So where will the justice be in the city? Plato famously has Socrates ask in the Republic. Which part? We've already assigned three of the four virtues to the three parts. The parts all seem to be taken. And the answer he gives is no part. Justice is in no specific part, but rather in the city as a whole. Justice exists in the city as a whole when each part of the city does its own work. And this means when the ruling class governs wisely and well, when the warrior class listens to the rulers and wards off external threats to the city rather than tyrannizing the inhabitants of the city, and when the working class is obedient to the higher classes, sticks to its work, and doesn't demand more. When all of that is the case, then there's justice in the city, when each part is doing its own work and not trying to meddle in the work of the other parts. Now, the psychological analysis that follows breaks the soul down into three analogous parts, Plato's famous tripartite theory of the soul, where reason corresponds to the guardian class, the rulers. Reason is analogous to the rulers. Thumos, which we've spoken of before in connection with the vice of anger and the virtue of calmness. Thumos, spirit, corresponds to the military class of the auxiliaries. That's the second part of the soul. And then appetite corresponds to the working class. So you have reason, spirit, and appetite as the three parts of the soul that are analogous and correspond to the three parts of the city. The virtuous person is wise in his or her reason, brave in his or her spirit. This is for Plato, not for Aristotle, right? And temperate in his or her appetites. But he or she is just when the three parts of the soul cooperate in the way they do in the analogous case of the city. When reason, the ruling part, governs wisely and well. When spirit, the auxiliary part, listens to reason and wards off external threats to the person. And appetite, the working part, is obedient to the higher classes, sticks to its work, and doesn't demand more. On this Platonic picture that I've just reminded you of, justice is conceived as the general virtue. That's the key point for Aristotle, that on the Platonic picture, justice is conceived as the general virtue in which each part of the soul is doing its work, and thereby making the person virtuous and good and happy overall. However, we can see that on the broader Platonic view, an older, narrow idea of justice as right dealing in distribution and exchange of goods and rectification in the courts, that narrow idea of justice seems to have been abandoned and forgotten. There is, however, a common thread between the broader Platonic idea of justice and the narrower Aristotelian idea. And this common thread has to do not so much with justice, but rather with injustice, the vice that is to be avoided in justice. And this is the notion of pleonexia, 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 which Ehrman translates here as overreaching. In some contexts, it would be more natural to translate it as greedy, as Irwin notes. So once again, I encourage you to look at his account of this in the glossary. Um, should have had this queued up. Where is this here? This is on page 388 and 389 in our text. There you go. Right there, the discussion of overreaching and pleonexia. And then continues to the top there. I encourage you to take a look at that. In some contexts, it would be more natural to translate it as greedy, because this is the state of the soul that desires to gain, but not just desires to gain. It desires to gain an inordinate amount, more than is right, more than your fair share. And it also always connotes injustice. So it's, in other words, trying to get more than your fair share by getting the better of someone else, by taking advantage of someone else, getting more than you're entitled to by taking advantage of someone else. That's the idea of pleonexia. So he translates it as overreaching. It goes beyond our normal sense of greed. The basic sense of overreaching, then, as it is used by Aristotle as well, is getting more than one is entitled to, or getting the better of someone else and gaining thereby more than you're entitled to. Thus, overreaching in this sense presupposes the idea, the contrast idea of a proper distribution or a proper share, because it involves getting more than your proper share. So a proper distribution, which can be violated if someone gets more than they're entitled to. Such a proper distribution would be standardly described by the Greek as well as by us as a just distribution of goods. And the person who abides by what is proper in this distribution will be thought of as a just person. And it's this is the traditional and more conventional notion of justice that Plato expands when he applies the notion of pleonexia to the classes of the city and the parts of the soul. So the unjust city for Plato is the one where the classes overreach. For example, when the mob of workers overthrows the rulers. That would, and the unjust soul would be one in which the parts of the soul overreach. And the analogous case would be the appetites overreach their proper role and seek to rule the soul. There's a connotation of not staying within proper boundaries, which are the boundaries of law. So this broad notion of injustice also is connected to the idea of lawlessness in general. And the opposing form of justice would be lawfulness in general, staying within the boundaries, staying within the law. Aristotle is not necessarily opposed in principle to extending the notion of overreaching and hence the notion of justice in this way, but he does think it leads to confusions that we need to pay attention to if we're not to be led astray. In fact, Aristotle may think that Plato's theory of justice is not a total innovation, but rather a creative reinterpretation of a notion of justice already implicit in common usage. We do sometimes speak of a generally lawful or principled person or condition as a just person or condition, state of affairs. However, Aristotle wants to save the narrower notion of justice as justice in distribution and exchange from confusion with Plato's broader notion. Furthermore, this more particular notion will have a place among Aristotle's virtues of character, since it does clearly pertain to the appetitive part of the soul. As we'll see, it's unique among the virtues of character in that it doesn't have two opposing vices. The nature of justice makes it possible to be unjust in only one way, which is a form of pleonexia or overreaching. Aristotle begins his account by noting that we are searching for the state of injustice, rather the state of justice and the state of injustice. However, there are two such states at issue in each case. There's the state of affairs that we call justice and the state of affairs that we call injustice, and the state of the soul that we call justice, and the state of the soul that we call injustice in the soul. So what's the relation? On page 79, beginning of the book, section 3, Aristotle writes, we see that the state everyone means in speaking of justice is the state that makes us just agents, that makes us do justice and wish what is just. In the same way they mean by injustice, the state that makes us do injustice and wish what is unjust. That is why we also should assume these things as an outline. So notice here, he's got to be referring to two different things, otherwise this makes no sense. So there's the state of the soul, but the state of a just soul is what makes us do justice, that is, produce a state of a just state of affairs in the world, and likewise with injustice. Or we might say that the just soul, the soul that possesses the virtue of justice, is the one that involves a state of wishing, habitually wishing for just states of affairs, and presumably acting in accordance with that wish. That's what the just soul is. Wishes for a just state of affairs. So you've got the just soul is in a sense sort of derivative upon this idea of a just state of affairs. That's another respect in which it's rather unique among the virtues, where the state of the soul seems to need to be articulated in terms of some state of affairs outside the soul. It's not purely an internal state. Aristotle next articulates three principles, which I've written out here. These three principles, 1, 2, 3. And these are articulated in sections 4 through 6. Three principles which he will use in order to eventually mark out the unique features of justice as a virtue of character, as opposed to the general justice that Plato identifies. So I'll simply summarize these here. So the first principle here is that a state, hexis, you'll recall that's the ontological category that virtue is in. Virtues are states. But a state is usually productive of only one of two opposites. So this is a very simple idea. Basically, the idea is health. Health is a state. And the state of health only produces health, never illness. Health only produces health, never illness. And this distinguishes a state from knowledge or technique, as Aristotle notes. So medical knowledge or technique can produce either health or sickness, either one of two opposites, whereas a state only produces one of two opposites. That's the first principle. Second principle is that we can identify a particular state in either of two ways, either by its characteristic product or by contrasting it with its opposite state. So, for example, we can identify health either by pointing to the characteristic products of health, absence of pain, mobility, healthy appetite, etc. Or we can identify health by contrasting it with the state of sickness. So by its characteristic products or by contrasting it with its opposite state. And then the third principle is if two or more distinct states are designated by a single word, there will be the same number of opposing states. However, these may be designated by different words so that we can, the opposing states might be designated by different words so that we can figure out which state is meant in a particular situation by the ambiguous word. And this is obviously for Aristotle going to pertain to the ambiguous use of justice in the broader, say, Platonic sense or the narrower Aristotelian sense. So, for example, the word, just give you a concrete example of this. The word plain might be an example of this. Plain. So plain, I mean plain in this spelling. Not like airplane, but plain. So plain might mean to say the same thing when, let's say, it's applied to a wall or a woman. So we can speak about a plain wall or a plain woman. And this might seem to be the using plain in the same sense or referring to the same thing. However, if we look at the opposites, we see that this plain is actually ambiguous in between these two cases. A plain contains a potential ambiguity that is discovered by looking at the opposites of these things. So the opposite of a plain wall, what's the opposite of a plain wall? Well, this would be a decorated wall. So it's a plain wall versus a decorated wall. But the opposite of a plain woman isn't a decorated woman. right? It's not like the opposite of a plain woman is a woman who's heavily tattooed or something like that. The opposite of a plain woman would be a beautiful woman. So we see plain as we can discover the ambiguity in the word plain by looking at the contrast that occurs when we're looking at the opposites in individual cases. And this is the technique that Aristotle will use to isolate the different senses of justice. He believes that justice is, quote, quoting from section 7, quote, spoken of in more ways than one, since their homonymy is close, the difference is unnoticed, or but since their homonymy is close, the difference is unnoticed. So justice is spoken of in more ways than one. In Aristotle's terms, they're homonymous. That is, the same name is used to mark out different things in the way that plain is used to mark out different things. In my example. But since they're close, the difference is unnoticed. Fortunately, he thinks we can distinguish different senses of justice by using this third principle here. The justice that is opposed to lawlessness or holding oneself above the law is what Aristotle describes as complete virtue in relation to another. And this will be what will be known as general justice. And he will also refer to this as lawfulness. So this is the general sense of justice that corresponds more to Plato's account in the Republic, although this is just a more generic version of that idea still. It doesn't necessarily involve the specific interpretation of what general justice consists in that Plato gives. So this is the general notion of justice. That's one sense of justice in the ambiguities that justice contains, the word justice contains. So that's what's commonly known as general justice. This is not a separate or specific virtue. This is not a virtue. Or we might better say it's not a virtue, with the emphasis on a, meaning this is not a separate or specific virtue. It just is a way of referring to complete virtue or virtue in general. But virtue in general conceived specifically as being exercised toward people in general, and that's what's built into this idea of to another. People in general, so not only towards those one has a specific household or friendship relationship to, but just as a person qua person. That's this idea of general lawfulness. Virtue, complete virtue exercised toward another, period, in general. The notion of justice in this broader sense originated probably because justice is unique in that it's exercised towards others in general without regard to their specific relationship. And this is the commonplace use of justice that underwrites Plato's more expansive notion of justice. We also see this notion in the Sophists' cynical attitude towards justice as benefiting others at the expense of oneself. Remember Paulus and Callicles, who had that view. However, Aristotle argues that there's also a specific form of justice that contrasts with this general notion, and this is what's known as special justice in our text. Special, but special in the sense of particular. So we'll throw that in there as part of the name. Special or particular justice. And so what is that? How are we going to isolate out a different notion of special or particular justice to contrast with the notion of general justice? In chapter 2, Aristotle provides 3 arguments for a distinction between general and special justice. So first, on page 82, we have here in sections 2 and 3, he says this: a sign that there is this type of justice and injustice is this. If someone's activities accord with the other vices, if, for instance, cowardice made him throw away his shield, or irritability made him revile someone, or ungenerosity made him fail to help someone with money, what he does is unjust, but not overreaching. But when someone acts from overreaching, in many cases his action accords with none of these vices, certainly not all of them. But it still accords with some type of wickedness, since we blame him, and in particular it accords with injustice. Hence there is another type of injustice that is a part of the whole, and a way of being unjust that is a part of the whole that is contrary to law. So, being glossed as follows, Aristotle seems to be saying that first, there are some actions that we can describe equally in one of 2 ways. Either as doing an injustice, or as some more particular forms of vicious behavior. So we can say, for example, that the person behaved unjustly to throw away his shield and run, or we could say that he behaved in a cowardly fashion. Or we could say that someone behaved cantankerously, or we could say that they behaved unjustly in snapping at someone. It was unjust for them to snap at the person in this way. Or we could say it was cantankerous. Or we could say that someone behaved in a way that was unjust by refusing to contribute to, the local charity. Or we could say that they behaved in a way that was ungenerous. So there are some actions that we can describe equally in one of 2 ways, either as doing an injustice or as some more particular form of vicious behavior. There are, however, other actions that can only be described as doing an injustice. So he doesn't give an example, someone acts from overreaching, but let's just say, a commonplace example, someone cheats you out of your fair share of something. That can only be described as doing an injustice. There's no other way to describe it. And this suggests, by analogy, I guess, with the other cases, that must be a particular form of vicious behavior called doing an injustice that's separate from this injustice in general. A particular form of doing an injustice that would be analogous to, cantankerousness or ungenerosity or cowardice. And to this particular form of injustice, there would have to correspond a particular form of justice. Just as to the various forms of the opposite of plainness, there correspond different senses of what plain means. So this is why he's employing that third principle. The second argument can be found in the next section. Section 4, he says, further, if one person commits adultery for profit and makes a profit, but another commits adultery because of his appetite and spends money on it for his own loss, the second seems intemperate rather than overreaching, but the first seems unjust, not intemperate. Clearly then, this is because the first acts to make a profit. So what's going on here? Aristotle is saying that 2 actions which are similar to one another may agree in being unjust in the broad sense, yet disagree as to whether they're unjust in the narrow sense. So in the broad sense, they're both unjust, but they're not both unjust in the narrow sense, in the actions that are similar to each other. So Aristotle's vague examples that suggest a contrast, something like the following. So in one case, say some kind of a grifter, con man, seduces a rich married woman and exploits her passion for him to get her to buy him expensive gifts and invest in his startup business before dumping her. And that's the first case. Sounds like plot of a late night cable TV movie or something like that. Okay. The second case is the case where a man seduces a married woman out of lust. So it's another case of adultery and seduction, even though it costs him dearly. Maybe he loses his employment for sleeping with his boss's wife or something like that. Both seducers may be described as unjust in the general sense that they were untemperate and did an injustice toward the wronged husband. They both committed adultery in similar ways. But the former case is worse, the case of the grifter who seduces the woman and then gets her to give him all kinds of money and then dumps her. Because in the former case, that person is doing something unjust in a narrower sense as well. Namely, he's defrauding someone, right? He's leading her on so that she'll give him money and so on. So he's not only unjust in the sense in which the other person was in committing an adultery and wronging the husband, and committing an intemperate act if they're doing it to satisfy their lusts, which should remain within boundary. But they're also doing something unjust in the narrower sense as well, in committing an act of fraud. And then finally, in section 5, he says, further, we can refer every other unjust action to some vice, to intemperance if someone committed adultery, to cowardice if he deserted his comrade on the battle line, to anger if he struck someone. But if he made an unjust profit, we can refer it to no other vice except injustice. This seems to be saying something like this, that there are different types of injustice, and we expect that for each type of injustice, a particular vice will correspond to it. Appeal to this particular vice is standardly sufficient to explain, in an informative way, why that type of injustice was done. So, for example, we could say, why on earth did he, sleep with that married woman? And the response might be, well, he can't control his lust, which is a way of saying he's just an intemperate person. So it explains sort of why he committed adultery. Or why did he run away in battle? Well, he's just a easily frightened person and he's a coward. It explains why he ran away in battle. But in the case of making an unfair gain, we take injustice to be the vice. But if this is to be explanatory in a parallel way, then there must be a particular as well as a generic sense of injustice. Otherwise, we will be explaining injustice by saying it's due to injustice, which is tautologous and explains nothing. It would be like saying, why did he cheat? Well, because he's a cheater, right? Why did he, commit an act of insider trading, and cheat in that way? Well, because he's a cheater. But that's just kind of repeating the account of what he did. It's not explaining it. So that seems to be Aristotle's third argument. Now, following these arguments, Aristotle believes that he's established the existence of a particular virtue of justice, distinct from the generic or the general sense of justice that covers all the virtues. So in 8 and 9 on page 83, he says, the unjust is divided into the lawless and the unfair, and the just into what is lawful and the fair. The injustice previously described then is concerned with the lawless. But the unfair is not the same as the lawless, but it is related to it as a part to whole, since whatever is unfair is lawless, but not everything lawless is unfair. Hence also, the unfair type of injustice and the unfair way of being unjust are not the same as the lawless type, but differ as parts to wholes. For the unfair injustice is a part of the whole of injustice, and similarly, fair justice is part of the whole of justice. Hence, you must describe special as well as general justice and injustice, and equally this way of being just or unjust. So this involves the injustice, that's the particular form of injustice, is a form of overreaching or unfairness in dealing with others. And its opposing virtue is fairness. So this is the particular sense then. It would be something like, could be described as fairness in dealings with others. This is the special virtue that is the opposite of the general virtue. Not exactly actually the opposite, but it's the part of the general virtue is what he says. So it's the opposite in the sense that special is the opposite of general in the sense, or particular is the opposite of general. But this is also going to be a part of virtue in general. So we have, this kind of picture, where the complete justice is virtue in general, and then the specific one is going to be one, just a part or subset of this. And this notion of fairness of dealing with others also clearly involves the sense that the dealings are dealings in goods. So I'm dealing with others in goods. But then that raises the questions of which goods and how. How are you dealing in these goods? Which goods are you dealing with? So Aristotle seems to struggle a bit to find a clear definition of what goods we have in mind. He first says on page 82, right towards the bottom of the page there, special injustice is concerned with honor or wealth or safety, or whatever single name will include all of these. Is there a single name that includes honor, wealth, and safety? And aims at the pleasure that results from making a profit. So we have honor, wealth, safety, profits are included in this account. Fairness in dealing with honor, wealth, safety, and profit. And pleasure, the pleasure that goes with these things too, which I guess we can leave implicit. Then also on section 12, right on the facing page there, a little bit higher up, he says, special justice, however, in the corresponding way of being, Special justice, however, in the corresponding way of being just, have one species that is found in the distribution of honors or wealth or anything else that can be divided among members of a community who share in a political system. For here it is possible for one member to have equal share or unequal to another's. A second species concerns rectification and in transactions. So here the view seems to be that it mentions the things that can be divided, that justice seems to involve the parceling out of shares of divisible goods. Is this a general name for these things? Honor, wealth, safety, profits. Hopefully you can read, that's a D, divisible goods. Fairness is dealing with others in divisible goods. Honor is divisible. You can divide honors, yes. Wealth, obviously. Profits, you can divide. Safety, just watched a documentary about the use of the London subway system as an air shelter during the Blitz during World War II. And maybe that would be an example of the distribution of safety. And there were apparently quite a few issues about how to divide up the choice spots in the tube. Okay, and this type of justice, I'm going to erase the general now. This involves two different forms: distribution and rectification. Distribution and rectification. So there's a distributive justice that involves distribution. That's a form of this special particular type of justice. And then there's what we might describe as a remedial justice having to do with rectification. So distributive justice and remedial justice having to do with rectification. And the principle for dividing the two types is whether the transaction is or was voluntary or not. As he says on section 13 there, which goes from 83, page 83 to page 84. So the idea here is a rectification is when you're dealing with the distribution of goods for an exchange that wasn't voluntary. And in other words, when you've been victimized by someone. An injustice has been done to you, resulting in the need to have a rectification. That's an involuntary situation, at least on one party. Whereas distribution is going to involve a voluntary distribution among the parties. So there's a distributive justice and a remedial injustice. And we'll say more about both of those next. So Aristotle begins in chapter 3 by describing the nature of distributive justice. Since this type of justice involves a transaction involving goods, there must be, at a minimum, two parcels of goods involved. So you've got the situation here where you have goods down here. Parcel number 1 and parcel number 2. This would be the minimum state of affairs. But in addition, there have to be, of course, people to receive these goods. So you have to have a situation where you have persons. Put them up here. Let's call these person A and person B, where they're to receive these parcels. This is the minimum situation of justice. So the situation of justice is going to involve, at a minimum, two people and two parcels of goods. But there's one more factor as well, and that is an equality. There must be an equality somewhere in this relation. So there are 5 basic factors in a situation of justice, at least. 2 people, at least 2 parcels of goods, and an equality somewhere. And so where should this equality be? Well, one natural and straightforward answer might be, well, we should put it here. We should say that these parcels have to be equal. The equality has to be between the parcels. But on reflection, we see that would not work. For example, if this is schematically describing a situation where A and B did unequal work on a job, and 1 and 2 represent their pay for that job, then making these equal wouldn't create an overall situation of justice, because that would be unfair. Let's say if A did more work than B, it would be unfair to A to pay A the same amount as B. So the equality isn't necessarily down here. And it's clear this equality doesn't need to be between the persons either. Thankfully, persons don't need to be equal in order for a just arrangement to obtain. In real life, people are seldom equal in many respects, let alone all respects. But if they're equal in some respect normally thought relevant to justice, say in the amount of work hours that they put into a job, well, that's still not necessary for a just arrangement. In order to have justice, you don't have to make A or B equal in the amount of work they put in. You can have a just payment system, obviously, if A and B did different amounts of work, unequal amounts of work. So Aristotle notes then that what actually has to occur is that there has to be an equality of the relations of parcel 1 to B and parcel 1 to A rather, and parcel 2 to B. In other words, you need to have a proportionate equality. The equality is neither between the persons nor the parcels, but rather in the proportion between the relations between the parcels and the persons. So it would be just if, you had a situation where person A did, 10 hours, person B did 20 hours. Obviously, that's a situation where these persons are not equal, right? In that respect, one person did that. But you can equalize the situation if, of course, you pay person A, let's say $100, and person B $200. Again, the pay is not equal. The parcels of goods that they receive, in this case, are not equal. But nonetheless, the proportion is equal. So you have proportionate equality. That's Aristotle's idea. If person A did 10 hours of work for $100, justice requires that person B, who did 20 hours of work, be paid $200. So for Aristotle, justice consists essentially in equality, but proportionate equality within this four-term relation, or, of course, it gets more complex the more people you have involved and so forth, but proportional equality, not strict equality. Proportionate equality applies across the board in cases of justice for Aristotle, not merely in cases of the distribution of goods, like this one. It applies also in the other case of rectification, when a judge, for example, has to come up with a remedy after the fact to someone who has been wronged. This remedy will involve restoring a state of proportionate equality between the victim and the victimizer. And he describes this in sections 4, 5, and 6 on page 86, when he says, "And so the judge tries to restore this unjust situation to equality, since it is unequal. For not only when one steals from another, but also when one is wounded and the other wounds him, or one kills and the other is killed, the action and the suffering are unequally divided, with profit for the offender and loss for the victim. And the judge tries to restore the profit and loss to a position of equality by subtraction from the offender's profit. For in such cases, stating it without qualification, we speak of profit for the attacker who wounded his victim, for instance, even if that is not the proper word for some cases, and we speak of loss for the victim who suffers the wound. In any case, when what was suffered has been measured, one part is called the victim's loss, and the other the offender's profit. Hence, the equal is intermediate between more and less. Profit and loss are more or less in contrary ways, since more good and less evil is profit, and the contrary is loss. The intermediate area between profit and loss we have found is the equal, which we say is the just. Hence, the just in rectification is the intermediate between loss and profit." In other words, we can look at the actions of the victimizer as a profit at the expense of the victim who suffers a loss. The result is this state of inequality, which is what the injustice consists in. And the job of the judge is to force the restoration of the state of equality. And Aristotle gives an elaborate, but probably unnecessarily elaborate mathematical example in the rest of this chapter to illustrate this concept. And we'll pass over that for the sake of time, but you can see a pretty good explanation of it in Irwin's endnotes. In chapter 5, Aristotle considers a challenge to his view that justice in general is a matter of this sort of proportionate equality. And this is the view of someone who might say that justice involves payback, in colloquial terms, what Irwin translates as reciprocity. Because Aristotle is considering actually a broader notion than mere payback. Payback would be just sort of a subset of reciprocity in this sense. Because reciprocity would also include reciprocity in exchanges, in bartering, for example. So reciprocity, this is a popular and naturally intuitive view of justice, that justice involves an eye for an eye. On top of page 88, Aristotle describes this as Rhadamanthus's view. If he suffered what he did, upright justice would be done. If you suffered the crime that you committed, if you had that done to you, have your eye plucked out for the eye you caused to be lost for someone else, then justice would be done. Aristotle's first reply is to note that strict reciprocity does not work in cases where the persons are of a special official status. So in section 4 there, he says, for in many cases reciprocity conflicts with rectificatory justice. For in instance, a ruling official exercising his office, if a ruling official wounded someone else, he must not be wounded in retaliation. But if someone wounded a ruling official, he must not only be wounded, but also receive corrective treatment. Moreover, the voluntary or involuntary character of the action makes a great difference. The crimes are greater, let's say, for assaulting a police officer than just assaulting any old person on the street. And the special official status that someone like a police officer holds can be viewed as a difference in the proportion between the police officer and other agents, suggesting that some idea of proportionate equality is involved in assessing different punishments. And presumably there are explanations for sort of what it is about holding that office that makes it worse to assault that person rather than some other person who doesn't hold that office. We, of course, don't need to get into that now. Reciprocity for Aristotle is most plausible as a concept in business exchanges. But here we see that reciprocity is dependent, again, on a more basic proportionate equality. So take, for example, a shoemaker who wants to barter with a carpenter to trade shoes for carpentry work on a house. Aristotle writes in section 8 here on page 88, it is diagonal combination that produces proportionate exchange. For let A be a builder, B be a shoemaker, C a house, D a shoe. The builder must receive the shoemaker's product from him and give him the builder's own product in return. If then, first of all, proportionate equality is found, and next reciprocity is also achieved, the proportionate return will be reached. Otherwise, it is not equal, and the exchange will not be maintained, since the product of one may well be superior to the product of the other. These products then must be equalized. The products must be equalized. To say that the products must be equalized means that there must be some way to measure the shoes against the house, a common standard of measure, like 4 pairs for every square foot, something like that. Aristotle believes that the existence of such a common measure is a necessary condition for the existence of any community at all. Unless people with diverse abilities can come up with some standard to ensure proportionate equality of their very diverse products, the basis for a common market does not exist. And without that, Aristotle seems to want to say, a community can't exist either. Currency is what enables this common measure. So it turns out that a common currency is the very basis of community, according to Aristotle. Section 10 there, he says in the bottom of 88, this is why all items for exchange must be comparable in some way. Currency came along to do exactly this. And in a way, it becomes intermediate, since it measures everything and so measures excess and deficiency. For instance, how many shoes are equal to a house. Hence, as a builder is to a shoemaker, so much the number of shoes be to a house. For if this does not happen, there will be no exchange and no community. Currency also, he later goes on to say, has the useful property that it enables us to guarantee a future exchange if the item is not required at that moment. So this completes Aristotle's account of justice as proportionate equality. And on this basis, he's prepared to give his definition of justice. So finally, we get the definition of justice, the particular justice. He says, so what we had before, we were just giving the concept of particular justice in describing it as a kind of fairness in dealing with goods. We weren't yet giving the conception. In that way, similar to what was going on when we were giving the concept of eudaimonia and then the conception of eudaimonia as complete virtue with external goods added. Here we're giving the definition of justice. So here's what he says, section 17, second paragraph, page 90. Justice is a mean, not as the other virtues are, but because it is about an intermediate condition, whereas injustice is about the extremes. Justice is a virtue in accord with which the just person is said to do what is just in accord with his decision, distributing good things and bad, both to himself and others and between others. He does not award too much of what is choiceworthy to himself and too little to his neighbor, and the reverse with what is harmful, but awards what is proportionately equal. And he does the same in distributing between others. Injustice is related in the same way to the unjust. What is unjust is disproportionate excess and deficiency in what is beneficial or harmful. Hence, injustice is excess and deficiency because it is about excess and deficiency. The unjust person awards himself an excess of what is beneficial without qualification and a deficiency of what is harmful. And speaking as a whole, he acts similarly in distributions between others, but deviates from proportion in either direction. In an unjust action, getting too little good is suffering injustice, and getting too much is doing injustice. So, the question that naturally arises from this definition is, how exactly does the particular virtue of justice fit the doctrine of the mean, or the intermediate? We can first note that the condition or arrangement that constitutes the state of affairs that is called justice seems by its very nature to involve an intermediate, since it involves an equality. An equality is a kind of intermediate condition between two opposing inequalities. One that would favor, one side of the equation and the other that would unequally favor the other. In my example, the two extremes would be the situation that favored A and a situation that favored B, and then the intermediate is the one that establishes the proportionate equality between them. That's the idea. So we can see what the mean is, what the intermediate is in the state of affairs, but that doesn't tell us what the mean is in the state of the soul, or whether there is one. And back in the beginning of chapter 3, Aristotle seemed to suggest that there's a kind of primacy to the state of affairs of justice, and that the mean in the soul is actually just kind of derivative on that. It's because the soul is aiming at this intermediate state of affairs in the world, where A and B are treated equally, that the soul has a kind of, as it were, intermediate or piggyback, a derivative or piggybacking of a sense of intermediateness to it. So at the beginning of chapter 3, he says, since the unjust person is unfair and what is unjust is unfair, there is clearly an intermediate between the unfair extremes. This is the fair, for in any action there's too much and too little are possible. For in any action where too much and too little are possible, the fair is also possible. And so, if the unjust is unfair, the just is fair, as seems true to everyone, even without argument. And since the equal is intermediate, the just is some sort of intermediate. So that's the just arrangement. But how are we to understand justice as a state of the soul in the person? And we see back in 17 that he says it's a mean not as the other virtues are, but because it is about an intermediate condition. So he seems to be saying here that because justice is a state of the soul that is about, or that aims at, right, it wishes for, the state of affairs described as justice, for example, in the opening of chapter 3, because of that, because it aims at that state, it itself is just. So justice is primarily an intermediate condition in the world, and it's only secondarily or derivatively a condition of the soul when the soul is directed towards that intermediate condition in the world and tries to realize it. Then the soul can derivatively be said to be just. So that's one respect in which justice is rather unique, that it's not that the intermediate is primarily in the soul itself, as the temperate person is, who has this kind of intermediate degree of appetite, or the brave person is, who has this kind of intermediate degree of fear or confidence in the soul itself, intrinsically. In the case of justice, it's nothing in particular in the soul itself, but it's that the soul aims at this intermediate condition that's out there in the world that makes it derivatively an intermediate condition. That's what he wants to say. So that's one respect in which the virtue of justice seems different from the others. Also, it's different in that there's only one vice opposed to it rather than two. The one vice of unfairness or overreaching pleonexia, which is a kind of unfairness towards the other person, injustice towards the other person. Aristotle says that the unjust person awards himself an excess of what is beneficial and a deficiency of what is harmful compared to the other persons. The deficiency that he describes is not a vice of the same person at all, like getting too little goods. If I get too little good because someone has done me an injustice, that's not a vice of me. It's a vice of the other person who treated me unjustly. It's the passive condition of suffering an unjust action. That's not my vice. That's the vice of the other person. It has to be done by a different individual. Or does it? And that's an interesting point Aristotle makes is it possible? We're asking the question, is it possible for me to do an injustice to myself? And this might suggest the kind of analogy with something like the pusillanimous character that Aristotle criticizes as someone who doesn't demand enough, doesn't stick up for themselves, right? Doesn't demand enough honor or whatever. Doesn't demand the great honors that that's due to them. Wouldn't that be the deficiency here? But it wouldn't be because of the nature of injustice. Injustice involves this act of distributing goods. And so the question is, can I distribute goods to myself in a way that is too little? In a way that also is unjust? Of course, I can take less than I'm entitled to. But is that an act of a form of injustice involving a deficiency in distribution of goods? Well, if you think about it, if I'm entitled to a tax refund, right, but I decide not to claim it, I haven't suffered an injustice. Rather, what I've done is I've given a de facto gift to the government. There's been no injustice there, even though I'm receiving less of paying more taxes than I need to than my neighbor does. I'm not receiving, there's no injustice there because I've decided that that's the way I'm going to distribute my money. It seems that pragmatically it's impossible to commit an injustice against yourself, so to speak, in a way analogous to the way the pusillanimous person doesn't demand enough honor for themselves, doesn't stick up for themselves. Because if you try to commit an injustice towards yourself, in the example I gave, what you're doing is actually something else. You're giving a gift or something. You haven't succeeded in committing an injustice. And this conclusion actually raises questions about whether there's any way in which one can do injustice to oneself. And chapters 9 and 11 contain examinations of these questions, quite lengthy examinations, which we do not have the time to go through in detail. So I'll just say here that the upshot of these arguments is that one cannot willingly be treated unjustly or do injustice to oneself. So we don't have time to go through all these arguments, but maybe we can just look at some of the considerations that Aristotle produces at the end of chapter 11, sections 4, 5, and 6, very quickly. So he says, section 4, now consider the type of injustice that belongs to an agent who is only unjust, not base generally. Consider clearly the corresponding type of unjust action is different from the first type. For this second type of unjust person is wicked in the same special way as the coward is, not by having total wickedness. Hence his acts of injustice do not accord with total wickedness either. In this case also one cannot do injustice to oneself. For if one could, the same person could lose and get the same thing at the same time. But this is impossible. On the contrary, what is just or unjust must always involve more than one person. In section 5, another case, or argument here, a little brief argument. Moreover, doing injustice is voluntary and results from a decision and strikes first. For a victim who retaliates does not seem to do injustice. But if someone does injustice to himself, he does and suffers the same thing at the same time. Further, on this view, it would be possible to suffer injustice willingly. Section 6. Besides, no one does injustice without doing one of the particular acts of injustice. But no one commits adultery with his own wife, or burgles his own house, or steals his own possessions. That is, if we suppose that someone is wickedly unjust to himself, suppose that were possible, he deprives himself of his fair share of some good by keeping it for himself instead. However, since he's the same person, if he keeps it, he doesn't deprive himself of it after all. Or suppose someone harms himself. This is unjust only if there's no rectification in the end, in which a proportionate compensatory harm is inflicted upon the perpetrator of the harm. However, in the harm originally suffered, when you harm yourself, this rectification has already occurred. You've already suffered a proportionate compensatory harm on yourself. And then finally, it's logically impossible, it seems, to commit an injustice with the use of your own belongings. You can't commit adultery with your own wife, or steal your own wallet, or invade your own home. That just doesn't make sense. So Aristotle concludes that one cannot do injustice to oneself. And this leads to our first discussion question, at long last. You might have thought I forgot, right? First discussion question. We'll keep this brief. Is Aristotle correct that one cannot do injustice to oneself? Why or why not? That's it. First discussion question. Is Aristotle correct that one cannot do injustice to oneself? Why or why not? Okay, chapter 10 concerns the concept of decency, which, as Irwin notes, might in some contexts be better translated as equity, decency. Decency is liable to make us think of something like proper dress in public, since indecency is probably used today most often as a legal word to describe some kind of lower level illegal public sex act, like indecent exposure, right? Its general meaning is respectability, which, like decency, can sound a little old-fashioned and stodgy to our ears today. However, Irwin is relying on the sense of the word decency that means doing the right thing even when the law doesn't require you to. Doing the right thing even when the law doesn't require it. That's what we mean here by decency or equity. Doing the right thing even when the law doesn't require you to. Or we might even say doing the just thing. Doing the just thing even when the law doesn't require it. So, for example, in the classic film, It's a Wonderful Life, decency requires Mr. Potter to return George Bailey's money, even if the law strictly didn't. Potter is a kind of poster boy for indecency. In the dictionary under indecency, there's a picture of, who is it, Lionel Barrymore or whatever plays Mr. Potter. I'm sure the actor was fine, but Mr. Potter, I mean, no one's more indecent than Mr. Potter. Aristotle notes that this notion of decency seems to have some connection with the notion of justice, even though it bypasses the usual source of justice, which is connected with laws and contracts. So on page 98, he says, it appears, sometimes when we reason about the matter, it appears absurd for what is decent to be something apart from what is just and still praiseworthy. For apparently either what is just is not excellent or what is decent is not excellent, if it is something other than what is just, or else they are both excellent. They are one and the same. So there seems to be this peculiar connection. And this gives Aristotle his definition of decency as a rectification of what is legally just. So sometimes it's necessary to rectify a just state of affairs itself if the justice is just a mere legal justification. This pertains also to this distinction that's probably familiar to us between the letter and the spirit of the law. Decency is rectifying a situation that might be legally just, but isn't just in some other sense. Namely, it's not decent. That's sort of the idea here. So what Aristotle is discussing here, oftentimes it's referred to as equity, which is the relaxing of the strict requirements of the law for the sake of achieving the ends of the law. Often equity is discussed in terms of equalizing imbalances in pay for similar jobs that may have resulted through unforeseen effects in the regular pay rate system. Also, a president's or governor's power to issue pardons and commutations might be an example of this. Aristotle observes that the very nature of law itself requires something like decency or equity in order for justice to be achieved. And this is for two related reasons. And he describes these, I don't have time to quote the passages, but he describes these in sections 4 and 5 on page 99. And what he says there is that no law can be, strictly speaking, correct. Aristotle says, that's his word. No law can be correct. We might say no law can be perfect. No law can be perfect because no law can possibly take into account all of the complicating factors that are involved in real-life cases. Laws must be universal in scope and hence necessarily abstract from all the particularities and nuances of real life. Even if it were possible to mention every possible nuance in the law, legislators wouldn't do that because then the law would become so complex and cumbersome as to be useless. So legislators have to balance the law's requirements of generality and simplicity. Generality and simplicity, those requirements have to be balanced with justice, the justice that it is intended to establish. So that's the first point. And second, because law has to have a universal scope, when it's applied to particular cases, it will need to be applied wisely with people with common sense, we might say. People using their common sense and intelligence, keeping in mind the purpose of the law in the first place. Otherwise, injustice is likely to result due to the particularities of the case. So, for example, a police officer typically would let you off from a speeding ticket if you're going to the hospital. Because the whole point of the laws against speeding is for safety purposes, to keep people from being harmed, injured. And if you're going to the hospital, if you're rushing someone to the hospital, well, that's in order to preserve the person's health or heal their injury or keep them from harm. So it doesn't make sense to punish you for doing what the law that you would be punished under is actually supposed to be promoting, namely the physical well-being of the populace. Okay, so that's this idea of the need for decency or equity in the rectification of legal justice. We've also seen that for Aristotle, justice is a virtue that's exercised in community and depends upon certain agreements and arrangements. Social agreements and arrangements typically take the form of written laws and also unwritten conventions. At the same time, we've also seen how Aristotle acknowledges a connection between justice and decency or equity, the correction of justice for the sake of some apparently extra conventional type of justice. And this broaches the topic of the relation of conventional or political justice compared with natural justice. That is, it's very natural for us to think that if there's some type of justice, some decency that involves a rectification of the legal form of justice, then doesn't that support the idea of two types of justice? One that's a political or legal or conventional justice versus some form of natural, and it'll put this in scare quotes here, so this may not be exactly clear what sense of natural we're employing here, but this would be the contrast we're now thinking of: political, legal, or conventional justice versus natural justice. In chapter 6, Aristotle defines, going back now to chapter 6, we just skipped over before, he defines political justice as follows. This is section 4. The politically just, he says, the politically just belongs to those who share in common a life aiming at self-sufficiency, who are free and either proportionally or numerically equal. So this kind of justice, he's saying, involves three different things. The citizens have to share a common life together. I guess that might be a fourth thing. But the idea is that they share a common life together in which they are collectively self-sufficient, or at least aim to be self-sufficient. That's, in other words, this self-sufficiency refers kind of to the idea of a community. The community is sort of a unit that's self-sufficient, or at least aims to be self-sufficient. Second, the citizens are free, and third, the citizens are equal. So they share a common life together, they're free, and they're equal. Those are the conditions under which political justice can obtain. Of course, these conditions may fail to obtain. Citizens may be dependent upon an external source for their food or protection. They may be enslaved, or there may be gross inequalities. In that case, Aristotle would say that political justice is simply absent, and the features that pertain specifically to political justice do not apply there. However, that does not mean that there can be no justice at all in the absence of political justice. He also recognizes, and this is in chapter 7, a natural justice in addition to political justice. Political justice would be a form of what he calls legal justice, or what's often called conventional justice. Laws of exchange are established by agreement or convention, after which justice requires abiding by those laws. So, 92 through 93, he says, the sorts of things that are just by convention and expediency are like measures. For measures for wine and for coin are not of equal size everywhere, but in wholesale markets they are bigger and in retail smaller. Similarly, the things that are just by human enactment and not by nature differ from place to place, since political systems also differ. Still, only one system is by nature the best everywhere. Some of the sophists, as we know, were associated with the position that all justice is merely based on conventions. And Aristotle clearly rejects this position in sections 2 and 3. He cites it as, now some people think everything's merely legal, but this isn't the way it is. He just rejects it. He doesn't have an elaborate argument for it here, but he rejects the idea that there's only this type of justice, and there's no natural justice. Aristotle's view is that there are both of these things. There is both a political, legal, or conventional type of justice, and there's also a natural type of justice. So he opposes the conventionalist position, as it's known, that would say justice is always just conventional. There's a natural, unchanging, or godlike type of justice, Aristotle suggests. But he's unclear about what sorts of things fall under this category, or what its basis is, or where the dividing line is between the natural and the conventional. He suggests in section 5 there that we look to those norms that are invariant from time to time and place to place. But beyond these vague remarks, he says little about the content of natural justice. This is arguably an underdeveloped area of Aristotle's ethics. But it's important to recognize that he at least adheres to the reality of both types of justice and their distinction from one another. Okay, so this leads to the second discussion question and the conclusion of the video. Do you agree with Aristotle's view that there is a natural form of justice? What would it consist of? Or alternatively, do you think that all justice is based on human convention? If so, explain why. So that's the second discussion question. Do you agree with Aristotle's view that there is a natural form of justice? What would it consist of? Or, alternatively, do you think that all justice is just based on human convention? If so, explain why.